two lectures we're going to have this afternoon on the history of Ball State University. I want to say some brief words about how these two presentations originated. Pam Mills and Rosemary Pleva 2 years ago were taking a undergraduate history research class and began to work on these topics that dealt with the history of Ball State, and developed two fine papers which since that class they have revised, organized, and made additional additions to. The history of Ball State, as you know, is an interesting topic for study. And Ball State this year is celebrating its 75th anniversary. So it's appropriate for the university to look at its history. And I think it's very appropriate that two people who were students at Ball State to do that as well. And our first presentation this afternoon will be made by Pam Mills, and she will be talking about the impact that veterans had upon the campus in World War II. I also might mention that there are two folks here this evening, or this afternoon, who were here on campus at that time. Mr. Leo Hopman, who was registrar at Ball State in the 1940s, and Mr. Oliver Bum, who's on the faculty and the administration at Ball State during that period. Also, Dr. Bum is in charge of the committee that is planning the celebration for Ball State's 75th anniversary, the kickoff of which will begin in June of this year. And next year there will be a number of presentations which will celebrate that 75th anniversary. So without any additional ado, we'll present Pam. Pam will make the presentation, and then Rosemary Pleva will, and then hopefully there'll be a few minutes for questions or comments. So, Pam.
Thank you. My paper is entitled The College Explosion, The Effects of Returning GIs on the Ball State Campus, 1945 to 1948. In November 1944, as World War II was drawing to a close in Europe, Congress passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act as an expression of gratitude toward those who had served faithfully during the war. The act, commonly known as the GI Bill of Rights, offered low-cost loans for housing and businesses, as well as educational and training benefits to aid in the rehabilitation and reassimilation of veterans into American post-war society. Studies conducted within months of the passage of the GI Bill indicated that as few as 500,000 of the 15.6 million eligible veterans would take advantage of the educational benefits of the bill. Furthermore, these studies also indicated that 80 to 90% of all veterans would return to civilian life without the aid of any organized educational program. In reality, however, 7.8 million veterans took advantage of the educational and training benefits offered by the GI Bill from 1945 to 1956. More than 2 million of them at institutions of higher education. Unprepared for the flood of veterans on college campuses, the nation's colleges and universities faced a multitude of challenges. The presence of the veterans precipitated questioning of almost every aspect of college life, administration, and education. They also pushed physical plants beyond their limits, necessitating rapid and often hasty expansion of classrooms and dormitories. Academia was forced into a double-time expansion, which was unanticipated even a decade earlier. Moreover, the infusion of federal money in the payments made for veterans under the GI Bill was the first large federal contribution to higher education since the establishment of the land-grant colleges in the late 1800s. Almost every college and university in the nation was affected by the GI Bill. Among those who were the most greatly affected were teachers' colleges, with enrollment increases of up to 580% during the years 1945 to 1950. Ball State Teachers College was no exception. In May 1945, just as the war in Europe was ending, Ball State Teachers College consisted of 5 administrative and instructional buildings and 2 residence halls, one for men and one for women, all located within the parameters of the quadrangle. There were approximately 550 full-time students enrolled, over 500 of whom were women. Since 1942, almost all intercollegiate sports had been suspended on campus due to the shortage of men. Social life had changed drastically on this female-dominated campus, and fraternities had almost ceased to exist. Within 3 years, however, Ball State Teachers College was transformed by the deluge of veterans, almost exclusively male, who came to the campus under the auspices of the GI Bill. The student population began to increase as early as the fall 1945. A total of 1,009 students, 47 of whom were veterans, enrolled for classes. While total enrollment was approaching pre-war levels, the student mix was still predominantly female. Because of this factor, women were housed in both residence halls for the academic year of 45-46, leaving men to find housing in boarding houses and apartments around the campus. Most sports were still absent from campus life. The beginning trickle of veterans really started in the winter quarter of 1945-46. While total enrollment only increased by 91 students, veterans within the student population increased to 201, making up 18.3% of the student body. Enrollments continued to rise in the spring, with 1,255 students, 413 now veterans. These veterans represented a mix. 47% were former Ball State students. 15% were transfers from other colleges and schools. And 37% were first-time college students. Additionally, 56% of the veterans who were attending Ball State were married, and many had children as well, a phenomenon almost unheard of before the war, when nearly all who entered college were single. While men did not yet outnumber the women on campus, their numbers were steadily growing, 538 men compared to 717 women. An editorial in the Ball State News summed up the general atmosphere on campus in the spring of 1946 as follows: "The fellows are happy to be home. The faculty and administration are glad so many of the boys came back. The track and baseball and tennis squads are getting in shape. And the girls, well, they're just happy about the whole thing." By the fall of 1946, enrollments had surged beyond all expectations. 2,200 students were attending classes, quadrupling the number enrolled in the spring of '45. More startling, however, was the increase in the number of veterans on campus. 1,060 veterans were enrolled in that quarter, 48.2% of the total student body. Male-female ratios had almost returned to the pre-war status quo, and most facets of campus life had resumed. Almost all intercollegiate sports had reappeared, with many teams playing full schedules for the first time since 1942. Fraternities were back, showing reactivation and growth. And clubs and social organizations were forming everywhere. The campus was alive with activity. During the winter and spring quarters of '46 and '47, the bubble of veteran enrollment held steady at slightly less than 1/2 of the student population, echoing national trends. For the first time since the war, however, men again outnumbered women on campus. By the fall of '47, veteran enrollment had reached its peak of 1,109. Total student population, however, had set new records, with 2,692 in the student body, reducing the veterans to 41.2% of the total number enrolled. By the winter quarter of '47-48, the veteran population showed its first numerical decline, dropping to 1,038. More importantly, the ratio of veterans within the student body continued to decline. By the fall of 1948, veterans comprised only 1/3 of the total student enrollment. The response of veterans to the educational opportunities of the GI Bill did not just result in increased enrollments, however. They also influenced all phases of college life. At Ball State Teachers College, one of the first and most pressing problems which resulted from the veterans' presence on campus was an immediate shortage in housing. Since women were housed in both residence halls during the 45-46 school year, and the private housing surrounding the campus was limited, the administration began to search for housing alternatives for the returning veterans. Complicating their search was the increasing number of married veterans who were clamoring for college-sponsored housing which would fit their limited budgets. Ball State tried many different solutions to the housing problem. First, the Ball Brothers Foundation offered the use of the Frank C. Ball home on Minnetrista Avenue as a residence for married GIs. This home was converted into apartments housing 12 to 14 families with a communal kitchen and laundry. Next, the Board of Trustees took advantage of offers from the Federal Housing Authority to obtain trailers and barracks from military bases which were being dismantled. A total of 30 trailers, 36 barracks apartments, and 3 small and 2 large barracks buildings were all obtained by Ball State to house veterans and other students. The trailer park and barracks apartments had to be located outside the physical boundaries of the quadrangle, pushing the campus beyond its original confines. Additionally, another offer by the Ball Brothers Foundation made the William C. Ball home available with the recommendation that it be used to house single veterans. Not only did Ball State attempt to solve the housing problems with temporary buildings and trailers, but existing dormitories were also pressed into service. In the fall of 1946, the Board of Trustees proposed that doubling up was necessary in both Lucina Hall and Frank Elliott Ball Hall. Doubling up meant 3 men to a room in Elliott and 8 women to a 3-room cluster in Lucina. Additionally, the 4th floor of Elliott was remodeled as a large dormitory-style room to house 48 single men. All of these measures helped relieve the housing pressures, at least temporarily. Housing, however, was not the only problem which the veterans brought to the campus. Veterans demanded classes, particularly in practical fields such as education, business, and engineering, fields which would pay off in increased earning power. These demands, in turn, created large classes and heavy teaching loads for instructors. The need for new faculty and new classroom space became increasingly critical. Classes were held from early morning to late night, breaking the old pattern of daytime classes. Even administrators were pressed into service to teach. By the end of 1946, plans were being made for new instructional buildings, as well as new permanent dormitories, a trailer court for student-owned trailers, and additions to the library and administration building. Other changes occurred on the campus as a result of the veterans. In March 1946, the Veterans Guidance Center opened its doors to process, test, and advise eligible veterans about their vocational, educational, and on-the-job training needs. Also, in March 1946, the Ball State Veterans Association announced its presence on campus by campaigning for an association representative to be seated on the Student Executive Council, giving veterans an active voice in student affairs. This association, along with the Veterans Club, brought in speakers, sponsored panel discussions, and hosted informal talks on subjects important to veterans and their families. The Veterans Association also attempted to convince the administration to eliminate the required physical education courses for all veterans over the age of 20. I might add they weren't successful. The Ball State News acknowledged the presence of the veteran population on campus both in advertising and in a regular column called For the Veteran. This column contained special information and stories about the veterans. Additionally, the news covered many of the activities of the Veterans Association and the founding of the Student Wives Club, an auxiliary of the Veterans Association. Veterans not only caused changes, but also questioned existing rules, regulations, and traditions on campus. One tradition which fell by the wayside during the years immediately following the war was the freshman beanie. Veterans simply refused to wear the traditional frosh beanie. Veterans also refused to honor the non-smoking regulation on campus. Smoking had not been allowed in the instructional building, residence halls, or on the quadrangle. Veterans, many of whom had begun smoking while in the service, simply ignored the smoking bans and lit up when and where they pleased. Others followed suit, and the smoking regulations soon fell by the wayside. The effects of the returning veteran on college life were many. In the short run, the veteran moved the college to quick expansion in classes, instructional facilities, and housing. In the long run, however, the veterans proved to be a catalyst which pushed the college beyond its familiar and comfortable boundaries, both physically and mentally, and caused it to redefine itself in terms of student population, role, and future plans. Additionally, the veterans changed forever the conception of who should attend college in the American mind. College became not only the province of the middle and upper class, but available to all who desired an education or a profession. The emergence of married student housing was a direct result of the World War II veterans. Indeed, post-war housing established for the veterans and their families was used by married college students in the 1950s and 1960s. Additionally, the acceptance of married students and non-traditional students with different needs from the traditional young single student was another direct result of the World War II veterans. The veterans challenged the administration to find solutions to a variety of problems, educational, economic, and personal, all within a short period of time and under extreme pressure. The response of the administration to the challenges was positive, both for the college and the veterans. The pressure of the rapidly expanding student body, spurred by the veterans, pushed Ball State physically beyond the boundaries of the quadrangle. For the first time in Ball State's history, parts of the college existed beyond the limitations of the original campus, a move which would continue. As Ball State expanded physically, its faculty also expanded, almost doubling pre-war numbers by 1948. Additionally, the ever-increasing enrollments led by the veterans forced the administration to rethink Ball State's role, both within its community and as an institution of higher education. From the post-war years, with the demands for increased classes and concentration on job skill-building curriculums, the seeds of the university were planted. The student veterans of World War II are now but memories. However, their effect and legacy lives on. They came to the campus taking advantage of an opportunity they would not have had without the GI Bill. They saw a college education as a means to achieve the American dream, setting new standards and charting new paths. The returning veterans were a catalyst for change, a change that was good for the veterans and for Ball State Teachers College. Thank you. Here.
Rosemary Pleva's presentation deals with the development of religious programs at Ball State University.
Religion in Ball State, the role of religion at a public university. The First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States forbids the establishment of a state religion. However, religion remains a prevalent part of the society in the United States. What then is the role religion is to take in all levels of public education? Taking a strict interpretation of the separation between church and state, some public schools have chosen to discard all forms of religion from their curriculum, rather than risk legal action. However, schools, including Ball State University, have determined the exclusion of all religion unnecessary. At Ball State, administrators have viewed religion as an integral part of the academic setting since it has served as the cultural, social, and literary background of the United States and the world. Before proceeding further, I should define what I mean by the word religion. Julia Mitchell Corbett, a philosophy professor at Ball State, defines religion in her book, Religion in America, as a religion is an integrated system of belief, lifestyle, ritual activities, and institutions by which individuals give meaning to or find meaning in their lives by orienting to what is taken to be sacred and holy or of highest value. The importance of this religion is that it does not advocate one religion over another. Although many administrators and educators thought that religions should be studied in public schools, they have struggled with how this could be accomplished. At Ball State, the study of religion has been accomplished through units on religion within other courses like the humanities, references to religions within other subjects like history, comparative religions courses, and extracurricular club projects and field trips. Religion has played a variety of roles at Ball State since the beginning of the university. When the Eastern Indiana Normal University Association filed Articles of Incorporation on May 14, 1896, Article 10 of the Charter read, quote, "Partisan and sectarian influence shall be strictly excluded from such normal university," unquote. However, after 3 deadlines had passed and the association had failed to raise the required money to open the university, Article 10 was amended so that the trustees could giving the trustees permission to allow a religious denomination to take over the property. The trustees altered the charter because F.A.Z. Cumlear, president of United Brethren College in Missouri, was willing to head the university if the school could become a United Brethren College. This attempt, like several others to follow, failed for financial reasons. Eventually, in 1917, the Ball brothers purchased the current school and gave the land and buildings to the state of Indiana. Shortly after the school opened in 1918, as the Eastern Division of Indiana State Normal School, the student religious groups began organization on campus. Ms. Hazel Bent, the General Secretary, Field Secretary of the Young Women's Christian Association, established a student group on April 2, 1919. Under the guidance of Ms. Valletta Baker, the YWCA helped students find churches in the Muncie area, helped with class registration, and set up pals for freshman girls. 2 years later, a student group of the Young Men's Christian Association was also established. During the 1920s and 1930s, the YWCA and YMCA were the most active student religious groups on campus. Both groups held weekly meetings with programs such as a series of talks on the Bible given by Professor William O. Lynch of the History Department during the 1919-1920 school year. Together, the YW and YM sponsored morning worship services and produced the Campus Directly, more commonly known even today as the B-Book. As a result of discussions concerning the coordination of student religious activities at the 1940 YW and YM statewide conference, a new religious group was formed on the campus in the spring of 1941. Called Religious Council, group members consisted of 2 representatives from the YMCA, YWCA, and each student denominational religious group. The group's first sponsors were Ms. Grace DeHorty, Dean of Women, Dr. Charles Van Cleef, Professor of English, and N.A. Scholl, Assistant Controller. Since its formation, the Religious Council has functioned largely as the coordinator of student religious activities on campus by connecting college students with local churches, promoting interfaith acceptance, especially through the ecumenical movement, and sponsoring religious activities and education on campus. One example of some campus-wide programming includes Know Your Church Night, designed to introduce new students, in particular freshmen, to the churches in the Muncie area. Another program was the Religious Emphasis Week. During the week, a variety of speakers talked about different religious topics, which exposes students to ideas of various religious beliefs. Religious Council has also sponsored numerous interfaith film festivals, song festivals, and prayer weeks. Religious Council had just been formed at the start of American entry into World War II. Its main focus at the time was developing interfaith relationships and assisting students and the young men on campus for the Army and Navy training programs in finding church communities. According to Ray F. Fitch, M.D., president of Religious Council from 1942 to 1943, civilian men on campus were almost non-existent, and some women who once were students were employed in the defense industries. As a result of the lack of civilian men, the membership of Religious Council was predominantly female during these war years. Beginning in the last few years of the war and in the following years, one major concern of Religious Council was racial prejudice. Some of the members of Religious Council took a stand against racial prejudice through their actions. Howard Waite, president from 1949 to 1950, remembers 8 or 9 members of the council, 1 or 2 of whom were African Americans, went to a cafe up the street from the Unimart in the village that had a whites-only policy. They were all served, and soon after the cafe changed their policy. During the early 1950s, religion began to play a slightly different role on the campus, since many students were being drafted into because of the Korean War. Niall Harper, the 1951-52 president of Religious Council, said in a letter that he struggled with questions about his life, his values, and the war. He eventually filed a statement of conscientious objection at the local Muncie Draft Board. Harper's statement was denied, but before he could be inducted, he was accepted into a seminary and reclassified as a pre-theological student. He indicated in the letter that many other male students faced the same situation, and although the council did not counsel people about conscientious objection, informal conversations were held among the members. Around the mid to late 1950s, Ball State and the rest of the nation had entered a conservative period. During these years and those extending into the early 1960s, there was more interest about religion on the administrative level than on the student level. As president of Ball State Teachers College, Dr. John Emmons greatly believed that religious life was a necessary part of students' needs and that it should be provided by the college. Because of this belief, Ball State participated in such projects as the Teacher Education and Religion Project, sponsored by the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education. The goal of the project was to find ways to teach religion to prospective teachers in relation to other academic studies, so that this teacher would then be able to teach it to the students. One result of the faculty discussions held in connection with the project included the expansion of the Religious Affairs Office and the role of the religious advisor. In 1957, the office was renamed Religious Counseling and made into a part-time staff position with Dr. Carl F. Andre, a philosophy professor, serving as the first advisor. Eventually renamed Religious Programs, the office expanded again in 1964, and Dr. George Jones became the first full-time director. The primary function of religious programs over the years has been individual advising and counseling for the students, but it has also served as a coordinator of religious activities, as an advisor for religious counsel and student voluntary services, and as an academic advisor about the incorporation of religion into the classroom. Although Religious Council was struggling as a group during the 1950s because of a lack of student interest, their programs and projects did continue. One Religious Council project from the 1950s, which I find particularly interesting, was the development of a meditation room in 1956. The purpose of this room was for meditation by individual students and faculty, regardless of their religion. Located above the main entrance of Assembly Hall in the library, the walls of the room were decorated with religious symbols of different faiths. When a religious advisor's office was created in the Pittenger Student Center, a room was set aside by the office for a new meditation room to replace the one in the library. A meditation room was also established when the office moved to a house on McKinley Avenue. However, this room was eventually used for office space, since few students and faculty actually used the rooms for meditation. In the 1960s, many students began to question the meaning of religion in their lives and the meaning of life in general. Charles Twa, president of Religious Council during the 1964-1965 school year, said, quote, "Many students had no desire for participation with a religious group while at BSU," unquote. But because the students were not as interested in organized religion, it did not mean that they did not question their values at all. The emphasis merely changed. Students were more interested in community service projects, and the religious groups that answered those needs experienced some growth. Groups like the Newman Club also began their spring break projects during the 1960s. Many of the first projects were to try and break the poverty cycle. Civil rights remained a concern, and the council sponsored many speakers and discussion on the matter. Also, David Henderson, president of Religious Council from 1965 to 1966, and a number of other students from Ball State participated in the Selma to Montgomery, Alabama Civil Rights March in March 1965. Evangelism also changed in the 1960s from the traditional preaching form to one that utilized socialization and discussion. In 1963, the Supreme Court's Abington School District versus Schempp decision firmly stated that school prayer or other devotional exercises were prohibited under the Free Exercise Clause of the Constitution. However, the decision did allow for the academic study of religion. Because of this decision and increasing student interest, Ball State, like many other secular institutions, began to offer religion classes within the philosophy department. The first two classes were offered in 1966. One class dealt with the comparisons of world religions, and the other class focused on the history of religions. Two more classes were added in 1969, Introduction to the Old Testament and Introduction to the New Testament. Since the early 1970s, religion has played a fairly conservative role at Ball State. During the 1970s, Charles Shannon, president of Religious Council from 1972 to 1973, remembers a few students were, quote, Jesus freaks, a few students were religious but did not forcefully express it, and most students expressed a completely secular view. Religious faiths were also becoming more diverse during the 1970s and 1980s, with more students claiming religious beliefs like Islam and Baha'i. This gave even more reason for Religious Council's work on interfaith relationships. Within Religious Council, the students and denominational groups were very supportive of each other and worked as a unified diversity, according to Elizabeth Owens, who was president from 1985 to 1986. In 1972, a religious studies minor was created within the philosophy department. When the minor was created, only 6 classes were offered in the religious studies program. But the program grew annually, and by 1976, a religious studies major was added and 17 courses offered, including specialty courses such as in North American Indians religions. In addition to the new religious studies courses being offered, other departments incorporated religion into their classes. In the winter quarter of 1976, Old Testament mythology was offered as a subject of an honors colloquium, and Old Testament as literature was offered by the foreign language department. Between 1970 and 1984, the enrollment in religious studies classes remained fairly stable, averaging approximately 100 to 150 students a year. Starting in 1985, enrollment figures began to increase steadily, so that by 1990, just under 400 students were enrolled in religious studies courses. Several reasons explain the increase, including a renewed interest in religion, but the main reason was the change in the general studies requirement that the university put into effect in September 1985. 2 religious studies courses were offered to fulfill the requirements. Religions in American Culture fulfilled the humanities requirement, and the Religions of the World fulfilled the International Global Studies requirement. Today at Ball State University, more stress has been placed on the diversity and internationalization that began to develop in the 1970s and 1980s. On campus in the 1990-1991 school year, at least 52 religions and student religious groups were represented. The traditional mainline Protestant denominations and Roman Catholics have continued to comprise the largest percentage of the student population, but world religions such as Islam, Hindu, Buddhism, and American sectarian religions such as Unitarian Universalist and Christian Science have been experiencing some growth. In the opinion of Dr. Richard Fears, a religious studies professor, the student fundamentalist Christian groups have been experiencing the biggest increase, and their followers have been becoming more vocal around the campus. Because of the increase of diversity at Ball State, the religious program staff has placed more emphasis on interreligious programming. For example, during the Persian Gulf crisis, the staff helped the Islamic students develop a program on Islam as a reassurance to them and as a learning experience for the non-Islamic students. Also, several religious groups sponsored an interfaith worship service during the 1992 University. Another recent development regarding religion on the Ball State campus is its relationship to the idea of wellness. Ball State in the 1980s began to stress wellness, which may be explained as a lifelong process emphasizing the integration of body, mind, and spirit through the acceptance of personal responsibility, resulting in the improvement and enhancement of individual, organization, and community health and well-being. Ball State's Institute for Wellness has defined 6 dimensions that are a part of a person's whole being: social, physical, emotional, intellectual, vocational, and spiritual. It has been in the concept of spiritual wellness that religion has found a new place in the university's future. Spiritual wellness is defined as the willingness to find meaning and purpose in human existence and an examination of values and beliefs. By working with the Institute for Wellness, student religious groups and religious programs have another avenue to present programs about religion within the university. Religious study at Ball State is not meant to indoctrinate the students in a particular belief system. Instead, it means to help students develop their own beliefs and understand the world around them. As Dr. Jones said to students in 1968, "You have entered the realm of the university. Here your faith and beliefs are not sacred. They will be challenged, examined, revised, renewed, and established. And this examination will be by yourself and those about you. This is the beginning of the never-ending process of re-examination and recommitment. This is the role of religion at a public university." Thanks.
Thank you, Rosemary. Pam, we have some time, so if there are some questions or comments that people have, we'll entertain those. Okay?
Yeah, Pam, you said about 33% of the GIs in 1948 or so were first enrollees at Ball State. They'd never come to Ball State before.
That was in 1946.
Okay, 46.
Yeah, 37%.
Did most new students come from within 50 or 60 miles of Muncie,
Yes.
the way the normal pattern?
Yes, Ball State still tended to be very much a regional college, and they spent a lot of time concentrating on that region. In fact, throughout the state of Indiana, during these post-war years, as all of the colleges were experiencing this tremendous growth, the people who were not being admitted to the colleges were out-of-state students. I would like to add, too, that I have up here the 1946 and 1947 Orient that shows some of the housing additions that were made, the temporary solutions, and also plans for expansion that were made in 46, some of which were never carried out. So if you'd like to look at those are available thanks to special collections.
John?
Two questions. One, were there any female veterans after the Second War? And secondly, was there any increase in enrollment as a result of the Korean GI Bill?
I didn't look beyond the World War II era in my research, although the overall research I'm doing on turning this into an article indicates that every time there's been a revision to the GI Bill, there's been increases in college enrollment. As far as the women vets go, as near as I can ascertain, there were 3 of them. And I found that in a photograph. That's and a mention in the For the Veteran column. That's all I've been able to find out. That's it. So nationwide, there were 60,000 women vets who took advantage of the GI Bill for education and training purposes. So they were definitely, out of 7.8 million, they were definitely a very, very small minority.
And if I could add to that, one of them served on religious council in, I think, 1946, 1947, and she was a Navy veteran, and she came back and was very upset. She was one of the other examples on racial prejudice because many of her friends in the Navy were African American, and she was really upset to come back and not be able to go places with her African American friends around campus.
Let's ask Ms. Pleva, did you examine the effect of the First Amendment on the role of religion at Ball State, State University?
A little bit. This is this paper is very much a crunch of the original one. As far as I can tell, it didn't seem to really have a major effect because a lot of the ways that religion was already being practiced on campus was within the classrooms as looking at it from a secular point of view. But I never found any mention of it within any of the newspapers or anything like that. So.
James?
Real very kind of see if Pam can add a little to it. The question about the returning GIs and race, did you run across anything besides what Rosemary added?
The pictures, there's no mention as far as any of the records like the Ball State News or anything like that. The pictures in the Orient indicate that the veterans that came to campus, at least the pictures of the Veterans Association and the Veterans Club, seem to indicate that they were predominantly white. Ball State at that time, as near as I can ascertain, was predominantly white. So I found no indication of problems with race, but then there's also no indication that there were African Americans, although I'm sure they were here. They probably just were not active in the organizations.
from?
During the war, the group that was here, an Army group, the STP, there were rather interesting men from all over, no women, at least the ones I had, I don't think there were any women. They were from all over the United States. And I think a number of them, in fact, because I was teaching at that time, I was teaching in the ASTP program as pre-engineering courses. And in those courses, it was interesting. And then after the war, a number of those men came back to do work here.
And worked on their
So
education
sort of
as veterans. Yeah.
caused us to get a broader influence over people because of
That's
that.
interesting. I had wondered about, because I knew that there was the Army program, plus there was a Navy program on
The
campus
V12,
during, the
wasn't it?
V12, yeah. That was on
V12.
campus during the
Yeah.
war years. And I wondered if any of those came back, but of course,
Yes.
you know, that's hard to ascertain.
I said, I think I had maybe about a half a dozen in my classes that came back and did work here.
Interesting.
Somebody have their hand up before we go. Mr. Hoffman, you mentioned one time, I think, about the crush of during registration during the veterans when they returned in the administration building.
Crush is an appropriate word. In the lobby of the administration building, outside which is now the reception area of the President's Complex, that had an information desk across. And on the day of registration, that area plus the central area of the administration building was compact as if we were giving gold $10 pieces. Had anybody fainted, which was the danger really, they wouldn't have been hurt much because all they could have done was slither down. Falling was a complication. And finally, I suspect in the second hour of the morning, in order to dissipate that group in the danger of the compactness, I went out, stood on a chair. We had figured by the number of advisors we had, we could see, I don't remember now, let us say 50 an hour or 25 an hour. And I had as many strips of tickets around my neck as there were hours available. And the announcement was, which I made, that we would give those tickets out according to the arrangement they were nearest the desk, so that could be maintained. And they would not have to stand in line in order to maintain it. They would just bring the ticket back. The tickets were according to the hours available. I came new as a registrar in the summer of 1956 to Ball State. And what happened in the fall with the registrar was an interesting way to capital B, capital R, and all of that, to break in a new registrar. Very interesting.
And didn't they have to change the registration process as a result of the veterans?
No,
I
wouldn't.
Or didn't they go to, I remember seeing pictures of large tables like in the.
Oh, that was the regular pattern. That we used to have tables, about 18 of them, in the gymnasium, and each table completed the registration. Faculty members were subject to my assignment at that time, and we would assign them locations, and we would know what they checked. That later on, if some serious complication of registration resulted, we would know who at which table had done it. those that are students now would be interested in knowing that one of the processes of registration at that time, there were 14 cards to fill out for those of classes and all the various offices and so forth. And all of those cards were filled out by hand.
Dr. Todd?
This is an interesting current smoking policy that's being discussed in the Senate, I noticed in the Daily News. When I came to the campus in 1942, absolutely no smoking anywhere on campus. The smokers would need to go out on a sidewalk to smoke. But when the veterans, or not the veterans, when the military people came in here, the B-12 people and the ASD people were referred to, they started smoking in the residence halls and never could do anything about it. And now we're trying to abolish all of it, go back to 1942.
Pam, did you find out anything about any more on the bringing in some of the buildings and the barracks?
They brought in, most of them came from local military bases. By local, I mean within a state or two away. They started out at reasonable cost, what I would consider very reasonable. The first ones to come in were military trailer units, which there's a picture of the trailer complex. And those cost $1 a year to rent. And it cost about $6,000 to establish that whole thing. The Ball Brothers Foundation donated the land, and they prepared it. It was located up about where the Muncie Eye Center is now, on Gilbert. And by the time they brought in the two last barrack buildings, which were the North and South Hall, which is where the Teachers College now stands, those cost $232,000 to bring in and establish. So the cost escalated considerably. They also brought in temporary barrack buildings for classrooms after '48. They quit bringing them in for residence halls, started bringing them in for classrooms. And one of the ones that was converted to classroom use was the Naval Reserve Building, which is where the Health Science Building is now. And that was in use on campus when I first got here in 1965. So yeah, these were added at various times, but at increasing in cost.
Any other questions? Well, I thank Pam and Rosemary for your very interesting presentations. I also would like to thank Professor John Kimberlides, who put together this program and took care of the advertising for it. So thank you, John. And again, thank you very, very much. And thank you all for coming.